assume you all know why we are here. We are fortunate to have a very good friend and excellent economist from one of the oldest university, Cornell University. And this session is co-organized by IBER, Indonesian Bureau of Economic Research, and Faculty of Economics and Business, University of Indonesia, and LPM, the Institute of Economic and Social Science. So 3 institutes. And IBER is basically a new setting network. And the mother who gave that IBER birth is Marie Kanbur. So she ordered me to open this session to introduce what is IBER. Okay, basically IBER is a network of economists and social scientists to do good quality research. And of course, not just research, but also to improve the quality of the policy debate. So eventually, hopefully, it can help the quality of the policy making in the country. And as I said, this is new. It's a network, and the members are practically all local and regional universities. By the way, Mary, if I made a mistake, let me know, okay? All local universities, and also there is a board, and the chair of the board was Pak Budiono, Professor Budiono, the former vice president, and the members of the boards. And I think some of you are here, and then Salemba is here, so he's a member of the boards also. About the Faculty of Economics, we have the team here, but I'm pretty sure all of you here, because I know some of you are from the region, coming from the region. If you have any questions about the Faculty of Economics and Business, University of Indonesia, the dean is right here, so you can explain to you. And about the Institute of Social and Economic, Institute of Economic and Social Research, or LPM, the director was here, Riyatu. So again, friends from the region, if you want to know more about that institute, you can ask the director of the institute. Anyway, so that's what the IBER about, and hopefully all of you who attend this session, these sessions, can participate actively to support the IBER activity. As I said, the main goal of the IBER is really to improve the research quality, improve the policy debate and support. And today, we are also fortunate to have Inaya, Dr. Inaya from the Physics UI. She will be moderating the session. And I tell you why we are inviting her. And Ravi can tell you later on that what he is going to present today is part of a big research project consisting of 300 social scientists around the world. And they published 3 volumes of reports and 1 small book. Why I'm saying this? You're supposed to explain this. Anyway, in that report, Inaya is one of the authors. Okay, so that is the reasons why I'm not only asking her to moderate, but also to share with us what is really the part that she's contributing and so on. And I think it goes without saying, if you look at the title, this is very timely given what's going on. Crazy things happening around the world. Okay? So I think it's very timely to discuss about the issue of anxiety and social depression. So without further ado, I give the floor to Inaya and lead the session. And this, I think, lasts for how long? Until what time?
4 p.m.
Until 4 p.m. Okay, Inaya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone, and Ravi and all the students. I'm Inaya, I'll be your moderator for the next 2 hours. Both Paiwan and Ravi has said that please be flexible with time, so I'm just going to play by ear and sense of how many questions you have or curiosity, so that's going to be my main compass for these 2 hours. I think our guest here today does not need further introduction. I myself have some really social sciences in the room, but the way I see your body of work is that you're seeing any of the macroeconomic changes with like social science lens. So something that left an impression on you and I read your introduction for the manifesto was the fact that human beings were at the center of looking at numbers, something that I think is a scarcity in Indonesia and many of the
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you, everyone. Very happy to be here, very pleased to be here. This is an unusual shaped room. You know, way over there and way over here and so on. And I remember being in rooms like this giving lectures. Usually they're very deep rooms. So I imagine the students at the back saying, Professor, please don't speak so loud. Some of us are trying to sleep back here. So I hope you don't fall asleep with that corner and that corner. So thank you very much. As Inaya said, we're going to play it by ear. I won't go on for too long, I hope, and then Inaya will speak about her contribution to the report, and then we'll open it up for this discussion. The main thing is to have the discussion rather than just go on and on. So, first thing, as any good professor, I've changed the title of the talk. It's called Addressing the Anxieties of Our Time, the Work of the International Panel on Social Progress. You have the PowerPoints in front of you anyway, they're printed out. So, here's what I'm going to be talking about. And I'll talk to you about what the International Panel on Social Progress, IPSP, is. But it's a three-volume report that has just come out. Rethinking Society for the 21st Century, report of the International Panel on Social Progress. That's going to be part of the basis of my talk. And there's a small book which comes out, a bit called Manifesto for Social Progress. And that's where the title for the show came from, but actually this is what I'm going to be talking about today. So let me, in case we run out of time, let me, where do I point this time? So let me just give you a summary of the talk, so that then you can all leave after that. So basically, the points that I'm going to make in this talk are the following. The last 75 years have seen enormous global progress in many dimensions. That's the first thing for us to realize. And I'm going to be talking at the global level here, okay? Not at the Indonesia level, not at the local level, but at the global level. So I will not have very much to say on Indonesia. I don't have expertise on Indonesia, but I hope I have some expertise on that in a global perspective, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on. Yeah, the point is that despite all this progress, and I'll take you through some of the progress, it's very clear that we live in an anxious age. It's very clear that we have anxieties about social progress, about the economy, and so on. And the reason for this anxiety, we argue in this report, is that there's a whole host of national and global challenges which threaten to swallow this steady march to progress at the global level. And the two challenges that I'm going to focus on in this talk are the following. At the national level, challenges that we face are addressing the forces that are making for rising inequality within countries. And at the global level, we face the challenge of how do we repurpose global institutions and create new ones to address a host of issues that cross national borders. So one is a national level issue. How do we address inequality within countries, within our nations? And second is a cross-border issue. How do we address cross-border issues? It's those two challenges, among many others, which I'll refer to the report for, which I believe are causing the anxieties of our time. And in this talk, I'm just basically going to scratch the surface of this report. It's a massive report. It's a 1,000-page report. So the report contains much broader and deeper analysis, and you will see when Inaya talks about the work that's been done on media and communications, the breadth of coverage of this report. So I do invite you to delve into this report. So let me give you a little thing on the International Panel on Social Progress. So just to repeat what I said, despite considerable progress in the last few years in social indicators, and you'll see the progress that we've made in social indicators at the global level, we live in anxious times. And to address these anxieties of our time, but to do so from a very broad interdisciplinary perspective, and interdisciplinary social science perspective, in 2015, a group of us constituted this thing called the International Panel on Social Progress. And that's the website, ipsp.org. So you can click on it right now, and then you don't need to listen to me after that. Okay. So, it's More than 300 scholars are involved in this panel. It's a massive panel. All disciplines, social sciences, humanities, from all continents, and we will be hearing from one of the authors in a while. So who is it? Who constitutes it? As I said, there are 300 plus scholars. There's a high-level advisory committee, which is chaired by Nobel laureate Amartya Sen. There's a scientific council, which I co-chair, along with Nancy Fraser, who some of you will recognize as being a very distinguished philosopher, and Helena Novotny, who you will also recognize as being a very distinguished sociologist. There's a steering committee, which is led by Olivier Bouin and Marc Levet. And the institutions, the anchor institutions, are Princeton and the Collège d'Études Mondiales in Paris. And dozens of other academic institutions, including Cornell University, are associated with this and many foundations, the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, Gulbenkian, and so on and so forth. So the objectives of this of the panel, first of the report, are to provide a comprehensive coverage of multiple dimensions of social progress, to make up-to-date social science more accessible and relevant, to feed social actors and citizens with ideas and possible futures, and to influence public debates, and to raise interest in social justice and a long-term perspective among thinkers and actors. What are the outputs of this exercise? First of all, there's a website with downloadable, all the pre-publication versions of the report are all downloadable. So you can all download them and you can give them to your students and so on. Okay? They're all downloadable. There's teaching material, there are video interviews, and so on this website. I think it's a useful resource for everybody. The first report of the panel has just come out. This is this 3-volume report, the Cambridge University Press, called Rethinking Society for the 21st Century, and there's a small book called A Manifesto for Social Progress, Ideas for a Better Society. The topics of the report are: what is social progress, trends and compass, socioeconomic transformations, that's inequalities, sustainability, cities, labor, capitalism and beyond. Very broad range of topics are being covered by these 300 scholars. Governance and politics, and values and cultures is also covered by this report. Of course, I won't be covering all of those. I'm an economist, but I cover narrowly defined economic topics in this book. Here's a list of chapters. There are 22 chapters, and you'll see violence, wars, peace and security, supranational organizations, and global governance. I'll be talking about some of those issues. Media and communications, I will talk about that, and so on. Okay, so it's a very broad coverage in this report, and I invite you, as I said, to delve into it. So there you are. Again, just to conclude this bit, introducing the report, the 3 volumes of the report, and this small book. But you don't really need to. You can just download all the chapters from the website. So let me start then on my main thrust. Here's a quote, which some of you will be familiar with. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. You recognize this as the opening paragraph of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. And that paragraph refers to the period before the French Revolution. I think it eerily matches our current state. Okay. Hope and darkness together, belief and incredulity, light, darkness, and so on. When I come over here, it flips. So, in many respects, actually, the world as a whole over the last 3/4 of a century, after the Second World War, has indeed seen the best of times. There has been no global conflagration like the Second World War. Here are some numbers. It took 1,000 years up to 1950 for the world per capita GDP to multiply by 15. But it took only 60 years for it to multiply by 4 between 1950 and 2008. So it took 1,000 years, and then in 60 years, well, that's saying something, okay? That's saying something. If one's going to be a gloom and doom merchant, this is what's happened in the last 60 years. Here's the evolution of annual GDP per capita for a number of countries, a number of Western countries, for which data goes back to year 0. This is the famous hockey stick shape, okay, where nothing much happens. This is per capita GDP, okay, per capita GDP, and then all of a sudden, around about 1850, it takes off. So things have not been too bad compared to the previous 1,000 years. It was the best of times. Here's some breakdown of this for individual countries. In 1978, China's per capita GDP was roughly twice its level in the year 1000. But 30 years later, in 2008, it was 6 times what it was in 1978. So it took 1,000 years for it to double, and then within 30 years, it multiplied by 6. This is real GDP per capita as we conventionally measure it. India, at independence in 1947, India's per capita GDP was 20% above its value 1,000 years before. In the next 60 years, it increased almost 5-fold. Not as spectacular as China, but still pretty spectacular compared to the previous 1,000 years. Life expectancy has increased from just about 50 years in 1960 to about 70 years half a century later. Over the same half century, infant mortality has fallen, I'm talking about global averages now, okay? Has fallen from 120 to 30 per 1,000 life births. This is all pretty good stuff, okay? So here are some charts and graphs. Here's the life expectancy graph at the top, going from 1960 to 2014. That's the dark line. And the light line is primary completion rates over the same period, over which we have data. This is global averages again, okay? Pretty strong improvement over the last 50, 60 years in these social indicators. Those of you who don't like income, here's the social indicators for each of that. Now here's an interesting one. See, life expectancy, of course for life expectancy you need life table, you need all that sort of household survey data, etc., etc. So you can't get that over a 1,000-year period, okay? If your household surveys weren't there. But here's what we can do. We do know how long famous people lived. We do know how long kings and queens lived, because we have records of when they were born, when they died, etc. So a very clever paper in Journal of Economic Growth is called The Longevity of Famous People from Hammurabi to Einstein. It's very clever, to find out what has happened to life expectancy over. Well, there you go. Nothing much happens for 1,000 years, 1,400 years, and then it starts. These are all the plagues and things which are familiar with the over the time. So there's another source of evidence saying, things have gotten better. Here's the evolution of human height. Of course, again, we have all our household surveys and so on, so we can actually find the height over the last 30, 40 years using data and so on, let's say. But how about the previous 1,000 years? Well, what you can do is to look at bones that are estimated archaeologically. And archaeologists can back out the height from the bones. That's this first. Okay. There's not much happening for that period. But then which institution keeps information on heights? Okay. The army. Okay. The army has always wanted to know how tall its soldiers are. And these are Swedish soldiers. Okay. Their height over a 200-year period. Massive. So, obviously soldiers and so on, there's selection bias and all that sort of stuff. But nevertheless, here's another piece of evidence saying things are getting better. The global Gini coefficient, I'll come to that because that's going to be a focus of mine, which is a measure of global inequality, fell from 72.2% in 1988 to 70.5% in 2008. A 2 percentage point fall in the Gini coefficient is actually quite a big fall for those of you who know how Gini coefficients. The global poverty ratio, applying standard official poverty lines and so on, which the World Bank does, fell from 42% in 1981 to 11% in 2013. So those of you who know average per capita income that isn't better distribution and all that sort of stuff. But here's some other evidence to suggest things are getting better even in that dimension, globally, global average. So here's global income distribution. I probably won't be able to say this. This is what it looked like in 1988. There's China, there's India, there's other Asia, there's the developed countries. And here's what it looks like in 2011. See, China's moved up, India's moved up. The developed countries have not moved up that much. Things are looking quite good from the developing country perspective on average as well. Here's the poverty headcount ratio, which I already talked about. This is the global poverty ratio, and this is the China poverty ratio. Obviously, given China's population, this is driving this. And yet, so it was the best of times, and yet, the sense of anxiety is clear, it's palpable. Okay, as we read our newspapers, as we look at TV, it's palpable, the sense of anxiety. Over in Europe and the West, you have Trump, you have Brexit, you have claims to Scottish independence, you have claims to Catalan independence in Spain, far-right parties are growing in Western Europe, there's subversion of democracy in Eastern Europe. This is the bad news. Now the bad news comes. Conflict and threats to democracy in Africa, there's Hindu fundamentalism in India, Islamic fundamentalism elsewhere, Buddhist fundamentalism in Myanmar, authoritarianism, states in conflict, refugee flows, South China Sea conflicts, North Korea, etc. It was the best of times, but it was also the worst of times. And of course, I don't need to, I'm not going to focus on this in this talk, environmental damage, climate volatility, extreme weather events, and so on. So here are some graphs to show you that, the other side of the story. Remember I said that the percentage of people in poverty was falling. What's happening to the numbers of people in poverty? Because the total population size is rising. Okay? So the fraction will fall, but the total number of people rise. And the one part of the world where things are going in the opposite direction is Africa. In Africa, the fraction of people in poverty is falling, but the growth rate of population in Africa is so high that the absolute number of poor people, the total number of poor people, is actually rising. And it's those are the people who are getting on the boats to come to Europe. To say that poverty in Africa is falling is true in the sense that the fraction of people below the poverty line is falling. But there are more and more people queuing up to get on those boats across the Mediterranean to Europe. The absolute numbers of the poor is rising. So you have to look at it in the right way to understand where the anxieties come from. So here's another little chart which might be of interest to you, which again I think tells us something about the anxieties. This is what's known as the elephant graph, because it looks like an elephant. Here's what it is. Okay? On this axis is the different points of the income distribution, from the lowest to the highest. This is the poorest person, poorest part of the income distribution, the 10th percentile, 20th percentile, etc., to the richest part of the income distribution, from left to right. On the vertical axis, it's the income growth in that part of the distribution. What happened to people's income at the very bottom of the distribution, in the middle of the distribution, etc., for the world as a whole. For the world as a whole. Okay? So you calculate the world distribution of income. Remember we had those frequency distribution, the world distribution of income in 1988 and in 2008. And you ask the question, at every point in the income distribution, from the lowest to the highest, where did the income growth happen? Who benefited most from growth in this period? Well, that's quite interesting, isn't it? The very, very, very poor lost out. Okay. They're not doing too well. The very, very, very rich did well. This is at the world level. The very, very, very rich did well. And these are the billionaires in Asia, in Europe, in the US, and so on. Towards the middle of the world's distribution, things are looking quite good. Where the real hit came in these last 20 years, the last quarter century, is in this period, in this bit here. this looks to be quite high up on the world distribution of income, and indeed it is. Who are these people? Who are these people who have lost out in this period where income has grown so fast and all the good news that I was giving you? Some people have lost out dramatically in this. These are the Trump voters. These are the people who, from a world point of view, are quite high up in the income distribution, but in the last 20 years they have lost dramatically. These are the people in Wisconsin, in Ohio, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, who voted Donald Trump into office. Well, and what Hillary Clinton called the deplorables. What a deplorable comment to make about your own electorate, to say that they're the deplorables. Well, they showed her. They voted. Now, I know people say the popular vote and all that. I understand all that. But if you hide behind that, I think you're missing the point. If you hide behind the fact the popular vote went to Hillary Clinton, you're really missing this point here. The anxieties that are leading to this. Now, I won't go into this because I won't focus on the environment in this talk. But here are various global warming projections and so on. You can look at that in the so more on forests and so on. Those are also part of the anxieties of our time, the environmental pressures, climate change and so on, which I will not focus on. Here's another one, which is very important in the European context just now, but I should say also in the Asian context. You only have to walk down the streets of Kuala Lumpur to realize the migration, international migration is happening here. Now, on this axis, just the years, and on the vertical axis is the percentage of the world population that is living in a place where it was not born. Okay. So it's not that high. In 2016, roughly 3.4% of the world's population, stock of the world's population, was living where it was not born. So that's not that big, right? Well, look at this trend. Look at this trend. Massive movements. But also, that's the world's stock. Okay? The migrants don't distribute themselves evenly across the population like that. Okay? They go to certain countries. 17% of Germany's population is now not born in Germany. Okay? The US, similar sort of story. And moreover, they're concentrated in certain areas, certain cities, certain whatever. Okay? So actually, the picture looks much different. Or rather, it looks much more concentrated than simply say, oh, it's only 3.4%. But also just look at this trend. So here are some of the anxieties that I want to, and I won't go into this either. This is sort of about armed conflict and war and terrorist incidents. So let me conclude this part of the thing by saying the picture we have is one of undoubted progress upwards, but of huge chasms opening up into which this progress would fall for generations to come. And let there be no doubt that progress can be brought to a shuddering halt. Here's a quote from John Maynard Keynes about 1914, which was a particularly interesting year. It was the start of the First World War, and it came at the end of a 30-year period of globalization in the world economy. From 1875 to 1914 is often called the first great globalization. First great globalization. And here's what Keynes said about it. What an extraordinary episode in the economic progress of man. This is Keynes writing in 1914, so that's what he said. That age was, which came to an end in 1914. In this period, escape was possible into the middle and upper classes for whom life offered at low cost and with least trouble conveniences, comforts, and amenities beyond the compass of the richest and most powerful monarchs of other ages. But he says, the projects and politics of, this is 1914, remember, the projects and politics of militarism, imperialism, of racial and cultural rivalries, of monopolies, restrictions, and exclusion, which were to play the serpent to this paradise, were little more than the amusements of the daily newspaper, and appeared to exercise almost no influence at all on the ordinary course of social and economic life, the internationalization of which was nearly complete in practice. So at the end of this period of globalization, the first bit of the quote, the best of times. The second bit of the quote says, something was coming. Something was coming. And it came in 1914, the First World War, and the 1920s and 1930s, the Great Depression. So, the rest of this talk, I finished the first part of my talk. The rest of this talk is the following. I can't, of course, cover everything that is in the chapters. The report touches on every aspect of those anxieties that I mentioned. And it covers it across the social science disciplines, using sociological perspectives, ethnographic methods, and so on and so forth. Okay? But I'm an economist, so I'm going to focus on the economic aspects of the report, if you'll forgive me. This is also the Bureau of Economic Research, right? So, but what I want to do is to focus on two issues, which are at the heart of this, I believe, are at the heart of this anxiety. One is rising inequality, and the other is, and I want to link these two together, are the global institutions, which we hope will help us address these challenges, but my view is that they're not up to the task. So let's start with inequality. Inequality is also, I would say, the best of times, the worst of times story. I've already hinted at this, but let me talk a little bit about it. Ultimately, I believe that inequality is a chasm facing the world in the coming 25 to 50 years. Now, this is not the place. I'm happy in the Q&A to go into the technical details of how inequality is measured and the mathematical details and so on. This is not the place for that. But suppose we take a very intuitive approach, say, apply an intuitive standard, the gap between the rich and the poor. The gap between the rich and the poor, somehow measured at the top 10% or whatever. You know, there are different ways of measuring it. The Gini coefficient, which I've already referred to, is a measure of this inequality. But if we take that, some measure of inequality, I believe that a fairly consistent story emerges about global trends and patterns. What is that story? What do we see in the data? I've already hinted at that in some of the charts that I put up earlier. The story is the following, and I'm going to tell it in pieces. Inequality in the US fell for the first 35 years after the Second World War. Roughly from 1945 to 1980, inequality fell in the US. But after that, from about 1980 onwards, it started rising and has continued to do so. Inequality now in the US is higher than it was during the period of the so-called Gilded Age, when we had all these Rockefellers and so on and so forth at the turn of the last century. Inequality, and we can talk about this in detail if you like, has also risen in the UK, in parts of Europe, in China, in India, in Bangladesh, etc. You notice I don't mention Indonesia, because of course there's far greater expertise in this room than I can sort of bring to bear. And the moment I say something, there'll be a question on it, so let me... But my understanding of the data is that inequality has risen in this thing. I'll leave it at that. I won't go into detail. These other countries, China and so on, I can talk a little bit about. But, so, the worst of times, okay? Inequality. What's the good news? Well, the good news is that there are parts of the world in which inequality has fallen. This is not a gloom and doom story. This is not one where it says, oh, it's rising everywhere, things are terrible, okay, whatever. There are parts of the world in which inequality has fallen. And the biggest part of the world is, where it has fallen, is Latin America. In the same period, when inequality was rising in China, when it was rising in India, rising in Bangladesh, when it was rising in US, etc., in that same period of the last 25 years, inequality in Brazil, in Mexico, Argentina, Chile, etc., fell during the same period. Further good news. So, inequality within countries is not rising everywhere. Here's another bit of good news, which I've already alluded to, which is China, India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, etc., all these countries grew faster than the US and the West. So inequality between countries, so to speak, if you take the ratio of the average US to average China, okay, that narrowed. So that dimension of inequality went down. Sure, so inequality within the US went up, inequality within China went up, but inequality within Brazil came down, and inequality as between the US and China came down. because the average of the US and the average of China came closer together, because China was growing 10% per year, and the US was barely growing 2%. So one way to think about this is to say, suppose I was thinking about the world inequality as a whole. You can think of world inequality as a whole as being composed of two things. One is the difference between the average incomes of different countries, and second, variations around the average within each country. That's what composes the total inequality of the world. Well, the between-nation component has gone down, as I just said. The within-nation component is more complicated, because the USA has gone up, Brazil has gone down, etc. So, good news. World inequality has actually gone down, as we measure it conventionally in our economics. So, what's to worry about? Good news, surely. The question is, what's around the corner? What's around the corner? And we talk about this in the report. There's an entire chapter devoted to it in the report. The big worry, from my perspective, is a massive technological trend. And this technological trend is one that is displacing in production basic labor in favor of skilled labor and capital. One can have technical sort of statements of these things, okay? But an image, if you want to keep it in mind, is think about South Korea in the 1960s and 1970s. Some of you will have seen those black and white grainy videos of shoe factories, where on the assembly line, hundreds of workers are gluing on heels, okay, on shoes. Or textile factories where they work. Okay? That's all done by 3 people behind a glass pane. As I said, you can have a technical discussion of this, but there's a massive technological trend which is displacing basic labor in favor of skilled labor and capital. And unchecked, this will lead to an increase in concentration of market. Why is that? Because what that does is that it increases the demand for skilled labor, depresses the demand for basic labor. When you increase the demand for something, its price rises, so the wage of skilled labor will rise. The incomes of computer programmers will go through the roof, but the demand for steel workers is going to be going down. And one of two things will happen in that part of the distribution. Either the wages will fall, or if wages are rigid, there'll be unemployment. So in the US, which has a more flexible labor market, wages have fallen, not so much unemployment. In Europe, where wages are rigid, wages haven't fallen, but Spanish youth unemployment is 40%. So, as I said, its manifestations are already felt in the US. I pointed that little thing in the elephant graph, remember? That bit, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin. This is the Rust Belt. This is the heart of that US industrial base. And, as we know, mixed with a toxic blend of xenophobia and fear of immigrants, it has led to Brexit and to Trump. Now, where these trends have not as yet fully appeared, in East Asia, for example, they haven't fully appeared. Of course not. Or where they've been countered, and we can talk about why Latin America countered these trends. They've been countered by policy in Latin America, and I'll talk about that in a second. There is, even in those places, there is no room for complacency. Because what happened in Wisconsin will be happening here in 10 years. And even in Latin America, where they had policy to counter this, essentially they're running to keep still, because the forces are leading to a rising inequality. Well, governments in East Asia have already started worrying about the potential inequality, and as I said, those in Latin America will have to keep running on policy simply to stand still on inequality. This is the sense in which we're living in an age of rising inequality. If somebody says we're living in an age of rising inequality, it's very easy to disprove. You just show that Latin America is falling. You show that world inequality is falling. How can you say we're living in an age of rising inequality if world inequality is actually falling? Why? Because the US and China move closer together, etc., etc. And Latin America is falling. But the sense in which we are living in an age of rising inequality is that the forces, the underlying economic forces, are making for rising inequality. You can counter this by policy, and of course the effects will be different in different countries. They'll play through a different time horizon and so on. I'm taking a very global perspective here. But there's a second sense in which I believe we're living in an age of rising inequality, which is that the capacity of domestic policy to address these forces is being constrained by various global constraints. And that's what I now want to talk about. 30 years ago, you could address these issues in a way that you can't directly address them now because of global constraints, not because of domestic constraints. That's a separate issue. We can talk about that. But because of global constraints. Let's talk a little bit about that. Actually, let me before I talk about this, let me just take up the following point, which is, suppose this technological trade is coming at you, and the demand for skilled labor is going up, demand for basic labor is going down, shifting the pattern of demand, and that's leading to rising inequality. How would you think generically about addressing this? It's a demand side shock. It's a demand side, demand for skilled labor is rising, demand for unskilled labor is falling. Well, there are three generic ways in which you can think about addressing this. One is demand side shock to shovel on the supply side. Since demand for skilled labor is rising, and if you don't do anything about it, the wages of skilled labor will rise, create more skilled labor to match that increased demand. So the supply increases, and then that keeps down the rising wages of skilled labor. Create skilled labor, and that of course is something that you hear all the time, what we have to do, what do they use, and all that sort of stuff. And indeed one can argue that that is what Latin America did. What Latin America did through programs like conditional cash transfers and so on over a 20-year period, they encouraged kids to stay on in school beyond the point, beyond the legal point, where they don't have to stay on in school. Through conditional cash transfers, like incentivizing families to keep children in secondary school, they did that. They kept the supply of skilled labor, which matched the demand side, and that's part of the story. It's not the whole story, of course, of why inequality in Latin America was mitigated during this. So that's one. The second is you redistribute. As this force comes through, income inequality increases, and you try and redistribute income after the event to make sure that the lower end of distribution gets it. That's a second type of strategy. One is you shove on the supply side. The other is you let it play through, but after the event you redistribute. Of course you do all these things, they're not either or. But the third one is the following. The third one is, why should we take this trend of technological change as being given? Why should we take it, accept it as being given? Actually, governments have in the past said, no, we will intervene to change the trend of technological change. That's what gave us the internet. What gave us the internet was the US military investing heavily in particular types of technology. It didn't just happen. It was a state which said we will do this. So-called DARPA and all these programs, it is well documented that this is what will happen. So I put it to you, and in agriculture, for example, we have a consultative group on international agricultural research. The Green Revolution didn't just happen. It was that international agencies brought Norman Borlaug to a field in Mexico, in Civet in Mexico, where he tried out different things for high-yielding varieties and so on. And that's what led to high-yielding varieties in the Green Revolution. So the notion that somehow the trend of technology is given to us from outside, and we can't do anything about it, I think is something that we accept too readily, in my view. Now, how we actually do it and so on is a different matter. But the first thing is to change the mindset and say we can do something about it, because we have done something about it in the past. Okay, so if these are the three generic responses, what are the global constraints to these responses? Why can't the government just do it? Of course, there are domestic political economy issues. taking money from the rich is always painful for the rich, and they won't necessarily allow it. And that's fine, that we can discuss and so on. But I want to focus on a slightly different thing, which is even if a government wanted to do it, there will be global constraints on it. What are those? That's what I want to talk about. So here's one. Mobility of capital and skilled labor leads to a race to the bottom on taxes. You need revenues in order to redistribute. You need revenues in order to have education. You need revenues to do this. But when you have capital and skilled labor being mobile across borders, this is a cross-border issue, it leads to a race to the bottom on these taxes, which lowers revenue in every country. Revenue which can be used to increase education and skills, etc. Even if illicit evasion was overcome, so this is often mixed up with illegality. That's fair enough, but even if nothing was illegal, countries competing with each other to attract business will drive down their tax rates together. That's what's meant by the race to the bottom. At current OECD efforts on this, I believe, are insufficient. Here's a chart which these are tax rates. These are corporate tax rates in the last 15 years in these parts of the world. See the trend? Global tax rates are all, corporate tax rates are all going down. Now, you could say, well, the reason why this is happening is because governments have realized that we're taxing too high and no taxes are good, etc. Fine. Consider the following explanation, which is that a conglomerate goes to the government of country A and says, you know something, we've had a great offer from country B. If you don't know your tax rate, we're going there. Of course, at the same time, they're in country B saying, you know something, we've had a great offer from country A. Which indeed they will have had. By the time this process finishes, they will have had an offer from both A and B, and there's competition. And we know this, you know this, just reading the press and so on, that the competition to attract capital is severe. And what that does is that it reduces taxes in both countries to the benefit of the corporates, but not to the benefit of the fiscus, from which the revenue would be needed to do all these things like education, health, and so on and so forth. So this, I think, is a really big issue. A twist to this comes from portfolio capital flows. See, this would apply in foreign direct investment. Okay? Portfolio capital flows are a very particular thing where if a government is in dire need of portfolio capital, I won't mention any governments. If a government is in dire need there and then, because if it doesn't come in, the exchange rate will just collapse. Just imagine the power that the corporates have on this. And they say, yeah, sure, we'll transfer a few $100 million across. But you in return give us lower tax rates permanently on our investments. And the government has no choice but to say. But of course they're playing the same game with the government of the other country. So when you have these cross-border flows, you get races to the bottom, and you get this. I think this is a failure of global coordination. It's obvious. I don't need to say. Consider now the mobility of low-income, unskilled labor, which is also a big issue. So the people who are crossing the Mediterranean are not all of the programs. People who are going to KL are not all of them programs. They're working in Malaysia, working in palm oil and so on and so forth. So if the government decides to take the redistribution route that I was talking about, in other words, help support the bottom of the distribution, what if that attracts more migrants in? That leads to a whole series of complicated issues about are the benefits available only for citizens or not, or what? But at the very least, it puts a stop. At the very least, it reduces the tendency of governments to be redistributed. That's the second type of example. And regulation labor standards is another example that I also. And finally, consider my third category. So remember the first category of responses I said was shovel on the supply side, education and so on. But you need revenue for that. And you have a problem with the tax competition. My second thing was redistribute. Okay. Well, if you redistribute, you're going to make it both ways, from the high income side and the low income side. And that was my second point. Now, what about this business of investing to change the course of technology? Actually, this proposal was made by the late Tony Atkinson, a very prominent analyst of inequality, who I sort of really admire. In his book, Inequality, What Can Be Done, this is one of his proposals, is the following. Why can't we invest public funding to incentivize R&D, which is efficient and labor-using? Using the new technologies in a labor-using way. That just seems so wild, because it seems to me, because we're not thinking about it. But the notion of creating an internet was equally wild. The notion of creating high-yielding varieties was equally wild in its time. I think we have to start thinking about this. But when you start thinking about that, you run into all the usual problems of public goods. This is a global public good. What is the incentive for the government of Indonesia to invest in this? What is the incentive of the government of Malaysia to invest in this? Okay. It has to be a global effort put together all together, because the global technology is being transmitted to all. So it can't be done by a single country, and that's why it's not being done by a single country. It has to be a global effort. Okay. So the point that I've been making in the last few slides is that managing national inequality is difficult because of these cross-border spillover effects. But management of inequality is only one of the things where spillovers occur. They occur in many other settings, and you're all familiar with this. Greenhouse gases, of course, financial contagion, infectious diseases, refugee flows, economic migration, etc. These are all cases where you have cross-border spillover effects. But what one country does affects another country, and vice versa. And how do we think about addressing these in a global setting? You have to have global institutions to address these issues. No single country can address the issue of refugee migration, for example, or R&D of the type that I was talking about, or climate change, or infectious diseases, or any of those things. So, as I said, the world clearly needs these institutions. In other words, the world needs institutions to provide global public goods. But what we find is that the global institutions that we have now are designed for an earlier era. They're designed for the post-war, immediate post-war era. They were designed in the post-war era, and they're designed for the post-war era. Okay. And these global spillovers were not important at that time. They were not important, and I'll give you an example of that in a second. The question is, can they be redesigned? Can these institutions that we have now, which bear the mark of 1945, which bear the stamp of 1945, can they be repurposed for 2020? Is the question. This is a very big question. I want to answer it using a very specific institution, just so that we have something concrete, and that's the World Bank. Not only because I used to be on the staff of the World Bank, and so I know the institution, and long may it survive because my pension comes from the World Bank, but you'll see my argument is that that institution bears the marks of 1944, you'll see, not 2019. Actually, next year, 2019, is the 75th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Conference, which created the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the IMF. On the 1st of July 1944, 700 delegates from 44 countries met in this small place in New Hampshire, US, called Bretton Woods. That's where the Bretton Woods Institution's name comes from. Lots of very interesting things. Why on earth would you have this conference in this wilderness in New Hampshire? It's because Roosevelt needed the support of a senator from New Hampshire on something else. And the deal was, you give me the conference and I'll give you the support from the whatever. So you see, there's politics there as always. But what's interesting also is that 1st of July 1944 is less than 4 weeks after the D-Day landings, after the Normandy landings. So just as they're landing to start the fight back against Hitler, they're already meeting to think, what will the economic order look like in the world to come? Just think of the farsightedness of these people. And the two names associated with the Bretton Woods Conference, one is the economist John Maynard Keynes, and the other is also the economist called Harry Dexter White, who's the American. So Keynes was the head of the British delegation, Harry Dexter White was the head of the American delegation, and between them, they fashioned the new world economic order. To use a phrase that somebody used, they were present at the creation. They created the new world order, and the new world economic order, and they were present at the creation. So here's a few things about the World Bank. So I'm looking at the time, how are we doing? 5 minutes, okay. So what I do in this, in my writings and in the PowerPoints, I'm not going to go into it in detail, is that I tell the story of this institution, the World Bank, and how it has been left behind in a rapidly changing world. What was the World Bank? What was Keynes' idea? It was Keynes who designed it, by the way. As between the two, Keynes designed the World Bank. The idea was the following. He said, what we have in Europe and in Japan is bombed out infrastructure. Completely destroyed. That's what the war did. It destroyed infrastructure. They need the funds, but the funds are all in Wall Street. But it's far too risky for any private firm to go in and do this thing. So what we will do is we will create an intermediary. We will create an intermediary for the World Bank, the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, okay, which will go and borrow from Wall Street and on-lend to these countries. And the reason why Wall Street will lend to this institution and not directly to the government of France, let's say, like we loaned one of the World Bank was to France in 1948, is because it's a cooperative of the world's countries, of the world's nations who have paid up capital and called it capital, and that gives a certain guarantee. It's a mutually and severally guaranteed loan. Brilliant design, okay, brilliant design for its time. And it led to investment. Of course, there were many other things, the Marshall Plan and so on and so forth. But this particular device, this particular sovereign loan instrument, and this intermediary that Keynes created was exactly right for its time, for the problems that it faced at that time. And of course, it succeeded brilliantly. As I was saying, from 1945 for the next 30 years, you had the biggest, longest economic boom in capitalist history. It's known as the golden age of capitalism. It's often referred to as the golden age of capitalism, 1945 to 1975, 30 years. Japan was rebuilt, Europe was rebuilt, etc. And then, as developing countries came on the scene, as countries became independent, of course, the soft loan window of the World Bank, IDA and so on, began to lend to Indonesia, to India, etc., and you're familiar with that. I won't go into the relations of the World Bank with either India or Indonesia. What I want to say is the following. Can this institution deal with the cross-border issues that I talked about? And the answer is no, it can't. Because it's designed to be country-specific investment. I lend to this country, the country invests in a dam, it then pays back. That country pays back. And that's the whole thing about debt, is that you have to specify who the borrower is and who the repairer is. You have to you can't have a general sort of stuff in it. I lend to you and you repay to me. And that was the beauty of the design. It was sovereign risk, sovereign loan to a sovereign and repaid back to the World Bank. Okay? And because the World Bank was this cooperative of countries, it could get money cheaply on Wall Street, which you could then pass on that benefit to these countries. But another reason was they knew that the country would repay to the World Bank because it was a cooperative of the world countries. It wouldn't default to the World Bank, it's a huge rate of exchange. But now we have this set of global public goods issues, cross-border issues, okay, where it's 7 countries who have a forest cover problem. Or you have 3 countries where a road has to run through it to take from the inland to the coast. or you have an infectious diseases issue, or you have this, or you have climate change, you have any of these sorts of things. They're all cross-border, cross-country issues. And you cannot use a sovereign loan instrument. By definition, it's to a sovereign. It's to go to this person. You have to specify who the beneficiary is and who the repairer is. Now, I know you can use various instruments like Apex and so on, Apex lending and so on, but really, in the end, you have to specify who the beneficiary is. And the whole point about global public goods is that it's difficult to specify who the specific beneficiary is of a global public good. So, in this new world, if the World Bank is to step up to do this thing for the new world, it will actually have to move from its signature sovereign loan instrument, which is the root of its success, to grant provisions. To actually not lending and borrowing and repaying, but grants for this global public goods. And the point is that the World Bank model has been taken over by the Asian Development Bank, by the Latin America, by the Inter-America. All these multilateral development banks are following the World Bank model. They will all have to change if they want to address these global public goods. I give you that as one example out of many, that the institutions that we have are not fit for purpose for the realities that we now face. And those are our challenges. We face these challenges. Where are the institutions? We look around, and actually they're designed for an earlier era. And that is, I think, at least for me, part of the anxiety of our time. We don't see these institutions addressing these issues particularly well. So I know I'm coming to the end of my time. I think there's a lot of detail in this thing which I'm not going to take you through. So all that talk was about these slides, so I'm just going to take my time. So let me conclude, and then I can give those people on a particular aspect. So I'm basically going to, I summarized this before, so I'm going to repeat it again, just so we know what I've done in this report. It's a massive report. I invite you to delve into the report yourselves. But the two things that I picked up in this, in this talk, firstly, a few things that I picked up. Firstly, the last 75 years have seen enormous global progress in many dimensions. I hope I've shown that to you. Okay? So we're not in a gloom and doom scenario. Okay? So anybody says, oh, things are terrible. No, have a look at what's happened to life expectancy. Have a look at what's happened to this, that, and the other. Yet, we live in an anxious age. And that's the point. You see, it's both the best of times and the worst of times. And for us analysts, I think that's a godsend, because we can lay out what's good, what's bad, what lessons can be learned, etc. The reasons, I believe, are that various national and global challenges threaten to swallow our steady march of progress. So the two challenges that I focused on in this talk: at the national level, addressing the forces making for rising inequality. We are, I believe, living in an age of rising inequality, and we need national level policies to address those, but there are global constraints on those national level policies, as there are global constraints on many global issues and many other things. And at the global level, we want to repurpose global institutions, creating new ones to address a host of issues that cross national borders. No, not yet, thank you. So what I've done in this talk is I've introduced the IPSP report, but I've barely scratched the surface. And of this rich and deep content of this report. The report contains much broader and deeper analysis and a host of ideas on innovations to maintain social progress. I invite you to delve into the IPSP report. Thank you very much.
I have so many keywords in my head, but if I can, just connect several aspects to the fundamental issue of rising inequality in our increasingly technologically driven, capital-driven world. And there are several aspects or several approaches to address this inequality, which is one is to increase the skilled labor, which is to answer to the demand side. There is redistribution of wealth in the form of conditional cash transfer, and then there is this uplifting, if not a hopeful solution to address R&D, to address this inequality with R&D, and by giving direct grants to skilled labor, potential skilled labor, to face this changing world. And this means that these aspects are not only global, but also local and national at the same time, because we have different specific themes that each country and each areas are facing. At the same time, we're facing very similar economical changes. We're living in a highly precarious world, and the question of governments and regimes become how they should act becomes a real core issue here. And instead of going through the keywords in the chapter that I contributed to, I'd like to not sporadically but thematically respond to your presentation. So I was involved in the IPS peer report rather later on, because they were looking into country case studies that has not been involved or delved in throughout the report. And that's how they, meaning the lead authors, two, Ramesir Rodriguez and Nikodri, who is two of the most prominent scholars in media communications. Then there's another 10 authors, and then there are 4 contributors talking about different areas. Among Indonesia, there's China and Russia, there's Mexico, there's also South Africa. So what they want and what the lead authors want by bringing these cases was to see different government traditions, different governance, different regimes in each country, and how they respond to economical changes, and how that affects policies, how that affects information governance in each country. And that was when, responding to your presentation, I, as a scholar based in Indonesia, began to think comparatively, because I had to bring the case of Indonesia and then put it side by side with different changes in these 4 regions, and then think again on the level of these dozens of chapters and 3 sets of reports to see how that links with the human rights agenda, how that links with the commons agenda. That's when I went back to your presentation and thought, actually, the conclusion of the media and communications chapter is really connected to the summary of your presentation. First, the thing that I wanted to highlight is Indonesia, as one of the developing countries, along with other southern regions, were part of the country that came in late to the development sector. Our infrastructure, media infrastructure, as our banking infrastructure, was a direct effect of global governance. And that was a moment in history when public institutions in different countries were integrated into a more global arena, in which there's a hope that these developing countries become more equal to their Western counterparts. But with this came along inequalities in access of information, access to education, because it means that only a small few intellectuals, small few education professionals have access to these scholarships, to these grants, most of whom perhaps are in this room. And this also creates local inequalities, because not all people have same access for upward mobility. So this is how we saw the low access of information is reflected in, or vice versa, the rising inequality in economic infrastructures are reflected in the inequalities in access to media infrastructure. So first you see Indonesia, where the media infrastructure was founded by the authoritarian regime, which was not founded but rapidly developed under the authoritarian regime to support developmental planning. So when reformasi happened, when democracy happened, these media institutions couldn't catch up with the commercial changes in which foreign content came in which US graduates now working for commercial television is beginning to produce. So lots of interaction with market mechanisms caused TVRI, the public television system, to fail to compete with commercial broadcasting. And this is reflected as well to the trajectory into digital developments. You see state enterprises owning up to 80% of the market share for infrastructure, and the Jokowi government, the current regime, is trying to invest in the border infrastructure so that people from the outmost areas can also have access to digital information and digital technology. But it doesn't stop there, because people, when they are included, citizens, when they're included in the digital infrastructure, doesn't mean that they are automatically bestowed with education. That's why you can see at the same time polarization between what you see in the US, the Southern Strip experiencing, these are the Trump words, experiencing a drop in, a rise in inequality and a drop in access to upward mobility. You can see that as well in Indonesia. So you see a division between not the haves and have-nots, but the people who feel that they are excluded from upward mobility with the people who they think are benefiting from social progress more than they are. So you see these two camps in the Indonesian elections, and this is an extension of how media infrastructure is unevenly distributed. So one of the two things, or these two things that I think was most interesting in the chapter, was about seeing information and communication, mainly education, fundamentally education, as a basic right. So if you have a basic right for health services, you have a basic right for education, you also have a basic right for communications, because this is a space in which you can gain a leverage or gain a competitive advantage, to use a politically incorrect term, to be part of the high-skilled labor. So this is part of the, if not the young intellectuals or young professionals or amateurish professionals employing mass online courses to be able to gain leverage, particularly those who are excluded from formal and modern education. So these are people also with low access to the digital information. And the second is looking at it as a commons. So if we see as copyright excluding people from accessing free information, free cultural goods, free flow of education that is facilitated through various platforms. It could be government-driven, it could be Wikipedia, like public goods-driven, it could be an open source like Linux, it could be many, many things, but its main driver is actually to make sure that as many people as possible throughout the world are included in the information sector, and the governance should be directed towards that. One of the things, several of the things that I'd like to contribute is perhaps that. I'd like to emphasize on the fact that inequalities, economic, are also extended in social, it's also extended in education, and communications can be a sector in which this inequality can be addressed, because information capital, information, education as a goods can be more openly distributed without any cost because it's digitized. So if there's any policy or if there's any commitment that the state has, it's towards distributing information to as many citizens as possible as a right and as a commons. So I'd like to end it with that, so that we have exactly 50 minutes. So we have more time for questions and answers. Should I open with the first 3 questions? Should I just give the floor to the Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Business?
Thank you. Professor Ravi, it's a privilege to have you here. What you just told us actually remind our problem in the organization of economics. The inequality between rich and smart kids and those who are not so fortunate. So the rich kids become smarter and smarter, and those less fortunate become isolated. I think we focus too much on the individual skill, individual talent. So the courses like math, statistics, and probably microeconomics and macroeconomics have been taught with more of the technical content instead of the message. So when we put students in the class, we give assignment, then usually the rich kids perform better than those less fortunate. After 4 years, then the class split into two groups. Those smart, extrovert, and look very talented, and those withdrawn. And I think the rise of extremism in Indonesian campus has something to do with that. So those who outside the circle, probably with not very good GPA, and do not have skill to convey their message, usually recruited by with intolerant view of the society. And it has been happening in our 10 big university in Java mostly. And I think we need something what you call the global public good. So as a dean, I think this is time to rethink how we teach our students. We don't have what we think with the global public good here is actually just class, library, but we need more than that. So we have been planning to do more about team assignment instead of individual assignment. So they will be working as a team, but not as individual. So in a way that will help to alleviate the problem of alienation between rich kids and those not very fortunate. Again, I like to thank your presence here, and I've been talking with the group. We have many teachers, we have many what we call technical teachers, but in Islamic world, you have reached the level of Sufi. You focus on your message and like the technical design. We can always study the technical thing, but the main thing is you focus with the message. Thank you, Professor Ravi.
So I think the Dean raises a very good point, and I've sort of written about this, going back to my 3 generic responses. One is the supply side thing of education. The second one is redistribution. The third is this R&D thing. The education response is the one that's most commonly made and it's easiest in a way, because you can spend money on it, and the World Bank can have a project on education and so on and so forth. So that's the easiest one. But it's open to all the issues that you raised clearly. For example, one of the very consistent findings, certainly in the US, which literature I'm more familiar with, is that if you look at, for children, it's now children, not university students, if you look at test scores, what are the determinants of test scores? Correctly for everything else, it's actually parental background which explains the test scores. So you can do whatever you want in the classroom. It's the extra time that's given to the child, either in the house, or through coaching, or through whatever it is, and all that goes back to parental income and parental background and so on as well. So the notion that somehow simply increasing the supply of education will address this inequality thing is too simple. And so in my writing I said, yeah, of course, we shouldn't not do it, but it's not the panacea. I think that I take very much your point.
Do you have any more questions? Should I open the question and answer session, please? Ladies and gentlemen, 1, 2, and one more question. 3. I'll give you in the first, the lady behind, and the final.
Okay. Should I just can you hear my voice? No. Okay. Okay. I'll move. All right. Thank you so much for for the presentation. So I have two questions actually. The first one, I was actually in the US during the 2016 election, not the best time to be in the country, I would say. So I saw the rise of Bernie Sanders and then...
Sorry, can you introduce yourself?
Oh, my name is Hilda, I'm from Japan, Southeast Asia. And so I saw the rise of Bernie Sanders and the word of socialism. So I would like to hear your opinion about whether there's like a legit criticism of this system that we currently have in that message. Should we start thinking outside of the box? It's like, are we even like live in? I haven't read that paper, so I'm not sure whether the paper is built within the confine of this like the capitalistic system, or is that like goes beyond that. So I would like to hear your opinion about that. The second question is about the role of militarism to the inequality and the discontent. This is probably specific for the US, probably, but because the US is such a huge economy, it affects the whole world in a sense. So, for example, in the US, there's always money for military, but not enough for health and education, which has more role for mitigating the inequality, right? Compared like investment in military. So, and at the same time, these numbers, like the inequality has dropped, means nothing for people like, for example, in Yemen, which is like a war-torn country. So I would like to hear your opinion also about the role of military and how it fits into this whole discontent and inequality, and also because military also contributes to the climate change, and climate change will in turn also contribute to the inequality, like further forces for inequality. So yeah.
So let's take 2 or 3 questions. Let people have their say, and then I can respond. Yeah.
2 points. First, your proposal of shifting the tide away from labor saving to labor using technology. Can this not be combined with more efficient use of natural resource? So the proper balance is not so much on labor saving as such, but to obtain appropriate balance between the labor and natural resource. So the sustainability will more be assured. This is point 1. Point 2 is to redesign global institutions. The world is such that we are in a global world, but we have regional differences. Africa is different than Asia and so on. Rather than moving to redesigning global institutions, why not concentrate on regional institutions? Let Asia be for Asia, Europe for Europe, Africa for Africa, and so on. That will be much more manageable. Thank you.
Thank you. You are talking about the age of anxiety. So now I want to know whether you have done studies. Which country is the most anxious in the world? From your presentation, correct me if I'm wrong, do you suggest replacing the World Bank? Last short question. We talk about inequality. Do you talk about perceived inequality? Because in politics, perception matters more than reality. Thank you.
Kalau yang nggak kenal, Profesor Aris Ananda.
Thank you for those questions. So, in terms of changing the whole system, so to speak, I guess we weren't as bold as that. I guess would be the honest answer to you. I'm sure in some chapters there was some whatever, but I would say it's more radical changes, but of the current system, I guess, as opposed to what we don't know what that would be. So I think that would be the honest answer to you. On militarism, so again, you raised a very good point, and it's also a technical point as well as being an important point, which is that, of course, by definition, all the data that we have is for countries which produce data, and countries which are in the middle of a civil war will not produce data. So there's a natural, you're right, there's a natural bias in it, towards seeing towards a good story, to see what I mean, and you're very right in that talk. And I've come across this in the sub-Saharan African context in particular, where you have many countries which are actually in the last 15 years, many countries have grown at more than 5% per year. Africa has had a really growth boom in the last few years. But there are many other countries which are mired in civil war. So if you take the average GDP per capita of Africa, almost by definition, you take it for those countries for which you have the data. And you're right. So I think I take that point. That's a very important point. As to whether the military is a bigger contributor to say greenhouse gas emission, that's an empirical question. My guess would be that the combination of Chinese coal-powered fire stations are far more emit far more greenhouse gases than say the U.S. military. But that's it's an empirical question. I don't know the answer to that. Back to the question on global regional institutions. Let me take that one. I think that's again a very interesting question. And again, I've written on this, and in fact, I've argued exactly what you say, which is that if we were to put ourselves in the shoes of Keynes and White in 1944, with a tabula rasa, everything, how would we design? And you may say, well, that's a pie in the sky sort of notion, but I actually think that's a useful exercise because it gives us some framework in which we can then begin to move our institutions. How would we think about that? I would agree with you that when there are say cross-border issues between 3 African countries, or between 4 Asian countries, or between 5 Latin American countries, there is no reason why there should be a global institution which should handle those, and the global institution couldn't handle those things. Okay? So in public economics, there's the so-called principle of subsidiarity, which is you move the institution closest to where the issues are. Okay. Now there has to be balance, because of course, if it was costless to do institutions, whenever there was a 3-country problem, you create an institution for that. Whenever there's a 4-country, but of course, it's costly to set up an institution. So there has to be balance between moving the institution as close as possible, with that you can only create so many institutions. And I think the right balance is the one that you mentioned, which is regional institutions. So in my writings, I have actually argued that in fact, more funding should be given to the regional development banks, like the Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, Latin America, and African Development Bank as well. And that the World Bank should genuinely be focusing on issues which are truly global. And there are enough of those. Okay? When a potential migrant leaves West Africa, travels through the Sahara Desert, comes to the coastline, crosses the Mediterranean to Europe, and then finds his way to Germany, which regional institution is responsible for that? Of course, none of them, because it's all pieces of it. That's an example of a genuinely multi-regional, global question. Similarly, climate change and so on. So I would agree with you on that. And that is in fact a design principle that I put forward in my own writings. The natural resource thing, again, I think is extremely important. So the issue that I was focusing on was employment creation, was job creation. If there are 2 ways of doing that, one is saving on natural resources, the other is not, then of course one should go with that. And that would be an interesting issue for us to discuss as to if there was a trade-off, which way would we go? Now let me just say something about the jobs issue. Keynes wrote a famous paper in the 1930s called The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And he envisaged what the world would look like in 50 years' time, when everything was done by machines, and he thought that was a great thing. Why? Because there'd be enough leisure. Keynes was as you know, Keynes was a great person for art and music and so on and so forth. He was married to a ballerina and so on. So he loved that sort of stuff. So his notion, coming from his class, his particular class at the time, the notion of having time for leisure was a big thing, obviously. But I think for us, it's more a question of distribution of income through labor. And that's why I think it's important. Job creation is important because it actually affects the distribution of income in the way that our societies are currently structured. So I would, for myself, I would still put the emphasis on the jobs, on the employment. But of course, as between two proposals, which let's say are equally matched on the employment side, of course, we would then go for this. So I put that forward as a way of structuring things. No, we don't know which country is most anxious. But that's an interesting. But I mean, people have done these surveys, and the sort of Latino Barometro and the Gallup polls and so on and so forth, and they do show anxieties rising. There are interesting things in Latin America, where whenever something comes out about Argentina, say, you go, oh, that's Argentina. they always think that they're so there are those sorts of issues in interpreting these things. So you raised a very good point about perceived inequality and actual inequality. And in fact, it's a general point about whether the sorts of measures and indices that I was talking about, economists typically talk about, the Gini coefficient, this, that, and the other, are themselves fit for purpose. Are they actually? And I think they're telling a story, and I think they're raising issues. But when you start delving into them, they're also problematic in their own way. The Gini coefficient, as you know, sort of combines what's happening in the whole distribution into a single number. No, that's valuable. But on the other hand, it misses out what's happening in different bits of the distribution, like that dip in the elephant graph, for example. So I would say, and that's one example. But I think the perceived inequality and actual inequality, and the lead example that I would give to you is, I didn't talk about this yet, is the evolution of inequality in the Middle East and North Africa. The narrative that we have, the common narrative in the press and so on, is that the Arab Spring was caused by rising inequality. You've all read that thing. It was the rising inequality which led people on the streets, and that's what led to the toppling of these regimes and so on and so forth. Well, actually, if you look at our data, inequality data, the same data which shows inequality rising in China, etc. In fact, inequality in Egypt and Tunisia, etc., was in fact stable or maybe even falling leading up to 2011. That doesn't say that inequality is not important, it's that the way we're measuring inequality may not be the right. It's a lesson to us economists, not to people. And exactly, it's perceived inequality. And people, for example, argue that the notion of certain things being accessible only to certain groups, the notion of wasta, was very important in the Egyptian case. So I think our report, the chapter in that report, also addresses these sorts of things. So I think that's extremely important. Finally, am I saying we're replacing the World Bank? So you know, I wear several hats. So one is I wear the hat of an academic who is free to range and to a blue sky and so on and so forth. I think that's an important exercise to have. If we had a free hand, how would we design this thing? Because I think it gives us a benchmark. It gives us something, and a concrete thing, okay? Say, well, this is how one would design it if we had the filter. Of course, we're over here. So how you move from here to there, whether you can in fact move from here to there, is a different, that's me wearing my other hat of a policy advisor in these institutions. Say, okay, we have the World Bank now, what should we do? How should we move it? So one, for example, would be to say, you create a window of grant facilities for global public goods, which is what has happened. They've done that a little bit. Not nearly big enough, not nearly sufficiently well targeted, and so on and so forth. But people like some of us have been arguing for that. well, that's a step in the right direction. So I wouldn't want to replace the World Bank as a practicality. But if I was Keynes and White, I'm not sure, for today, I'm not sure that I would have the World Bank of today as a new student. So I think one has to balance that. Yes. Is there somebody in that corner?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Somebody in microphone.
Hi, my name is Monica, and I happen to be from the World Bank here.
Well, as a fellow World Banker, as I said, I hope my pension stays safe.
And I'm former student of Professor Iman Aziz, so I hear a lot about his criticism about the World Bank. So I bear with that. Now I mean I'm speaking here as an academic, and I think like yourself, like I will look at the World Bank both as from its weaknesses and its strength. But I think I would like to mention here that I happen to work in the team at the World Bank who never actually give lending, but only knowledge products. So I think itself, like the fact that the World Bank has the world's knowledge, I think that can be seen as global public goods. And I mean, working from the World Bank compared to working in a domestic institutions, I feel the really big difference in terms of like working with people from across the world who bring global expertise than compared to working more in a local institution. So I think World Bank needs to be seen not only a financial bank but also a knowledge bank. My questions here is, when you talk about creating a bigger windows of grants to build more global public goods, like where would the grant come from? Like, countries will not just give grants, but even the World Bank needs to sustain itself. And my second question is global coordinations, like when we talk about the greenhouse effects, the financial spillovers, and global spillovers, basically, is global coordination a myth, or is something that like we can work on? And what are the concrete solutions really coming out from these studies about how to build better global coordination and better global public goods? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for a very stimulating and I guess thought-provoking talk. And maybe we don't have an anxiety measure, but we do have a happiness index. So maybe we just ask who is the most unhappiest person in the world, or in the countries in the world. And there's also an optimistic index. Yeah. So according to President Jokowi, who gave a speech at one of the forums in Bali, Indonesia is in the top 10 happiest people in the world, and we are supposed to be the most optimistic people in the world. But nevertheless, I'm still anxious because of all the issues you raised. So first question is about the labor displacement due to technological change. I just wonder, how does this technological change compare to previous technological disruptions in the past? Because obviously this is not the first time we are experiencing a technological disruption, and if I'm not mistaken, in previous technological disruptions, there are jobs lost, but there are also jobs created, jobs that did not exist before. And over a certain period of time, it's positive, like the net jobs created are positive. And probably what were the types of policies? I mean, you mentioned a few, like R&D and what was the other one? The cash transfer to keep people in school. So will those work with the new technological disruption? I mean, our feeling is that We don't know. Probably nobody knows the answer, because they're the jobs that are jobs of the future. We don't even know what they look like, and I think it's the speed of change, which will be faster than before. And to kind of add to Emil's question about labor saving and labor using, and you kind of mentioned that your colleague, Professor Basu, he was here last year, and his proposal is, of course, a universal income, right? So, okay, you work less, but you have better quality of life, and you do more decent work, because what's being displaced is the routine work, the dirty work, yeah. So you'll have new jobs, but maybe you work less hours and it's more decent work, and you have more time for leisure. But then who pays for the additional universal income tax or whatever it is? I mean, Professor Basu's recommendation was, well, you got to tax all those Google and Apple, the 5 big guys who are making extraordinary, huge profits, right? That was his answer, but I just wondered what you thought about that. Second, on global institutions, fit for purpose global institutions. We had lots of discussion about this in Bali, as you can imagine. And I don't know, I'm sure you followed the news that our president's view is that winter is coming. We shouldn't be fighting with each other, but we should be finding ways to cooperate on the global challenges that we have. Basically, that's his view. So, but when put to task, okay, what does this mean? Yeah, you mentioned a few of this. I just wanted to touch on a few things. So I agree with you that these global institutions need to focus on the global public goods. Yeah, whether it's climate change, whether it's my focus is on trade. So the rules-based world economic order, sustainable development, those are the global public goods. And there was a lot of talk actually in Bali about whether the instruments that you were saying were fit for purpose, and they're not, right? So the notion now, and this is quite interesting, I found, that a lot of the multilateral development banks, regional development banks, they were actually standing up and saying that we are going to change the way we give loans to have climate resilient parameters and sustainable development parameters built in. I mean, ADB actually said 75% of their loans will be climate resilient and sustainable development related. So even though it's being given to a country, but you are still having this global public good as an objective, not just building infrastructure, but building climate resilient infrastructure and so on. And there was a lot of talk about partnerships. So I think the other thing about global institutions not fit for purpose is the fact that it can't just be governments or multilateral development banks that do this alone, right? How do you build in multi-stakeholder participation, whether it's the private sector, whether it's CSO, whether it's grant money, whether it's philanthropy money. So there was a lot of talk about that. And I think the way these institutions are being run, it's a government-to-government thing. And there's another series of discussion that it can't just be government-to-government anymore. It has to be multi-stakeholder, and what Pascal Lamy calls poly-governance. The governance can't just come from negotiators and government-to-government only. So I think those are some of the new ideas that came out, and Emil mentioned regional. So multilateral is so difficult to come to an agreement, especially in the case of WTO. 160 countries to come to a consensus, that's why it has never moved beyond Doha round since 2008. Meanwhile, the world has moved, issues have moved. So the idea is regional, as Emil was mentioned, or plurilateral. You get a small group of countries to agree first. But still, you can have that happen, but if they're doing it in all different directions, you're going to have a mess, right? So how do you have these different initiatives happen at regional, plurilateral level, but moving in the same direction for the multilateral? So it's kind of the building blocks ideas now. I don't know whether that's possible, but these are some of the discussions that came out of Bali, so I'd be very interested to know what you thought about that. And my final question is actually to the moderator, if I may. She said that, information is human right, right? Like education and health. The right to information, the right to access to information, but not just access. Access is only sufficient but not necessary for you to be able to get the benefit from being connected. And therefore you need to do more than just be connected. Being connected is only the first step, and being connected alone is about the infrastructure, the telecommunications infrastructure, and having the instrument. Yeah, and actually before that you have to have electricity, by the way. This is, Professor Basu also mentioned this point. You have to have electricity and you have to have basic sanitation and clean water. If you're not healthy, how can you be functioning? Yeah, human capital is not going to be good. And I would say that in the connectivity that we don't talk about a lot is digital identity, right? In India, I think Africa, probably China, if you don't have a digital identity, you cannot be part of the digital connectivity. And this is a big question for Indonesia, as we know. Whenever I say IKTP, everybody just roll their eyes, right? But actually we do need IKTP, otherwise you cannot be included in this. So the second part of it is, you said access and capacity to use that access. So where are we on that, and maybe some thoughts on how we can actually do that. Capacity to access and wisdom, right? Wisdom to use that access, because we have this, part of the anxiety and what Ari was mentioning earlier, all the false information, the way you can incite negative perceptions and even wrong perceptions, and it can go very quickly in the wrong way. You know, how do we manage that?
Thank you. My name is Asep Suryahadi from Semeru Research Institute. I have two questions on inequality. The first one, looking at your global growth incident curve on slide 29, I see that all parts of the curve still above zero, meaning that everybody's income is still increasing over time. So my question is, why should we worry about inequalities increasing when everybody is actually better off over time? Secondly, the reason of increasing inequality according to Piketty is because the return to capital is much higher than the return to labor, and it's increasing over time. One way to interpret it is that simply because there are too many people in the world. So should we revisit the idea of population growth control and family planning and so on, which we now seem to have forgotten about it? Thank you.
That was actually in the chapter that we wrote, because it seems like we are playing catch up with inequality. So when it seems like things are moving to a good direction, and then types of inequalities are emerging, which made me think about the first question from Milda about whether there's an alternative form of economy, because different from the other chapters, I think the chapter that we wrote, which was led by the two lead authors, were written by people who had a strong footing in media studies. So media studies is like a third to fourth generation of critical studies and responding to changes that don't seem to make society better off. It creates worsening inequalities, social inequalities, and it seems that there has not been an alternative mode of economy since the triumph of neoliberal reorganization since the 60s, 70s. So we had that similar worldview when we wrote the chapter, and we were very aware of the fact that without any structural changes, these spaces in which knowledge and education and communication exist, it could bring up more mobility for different people who might not traditionally be inside of the public sphere. So they might not have higher education, but with more open information, they can get leverage. This does not mean that this means that without any direction, a clear direction towards redistributing of wealth, this could be another extension of inequalities that is prolonged through the digital sector. Which goes to Aris's question regarding perceived inequalities. I would like to, if permitted, bring my own research on this, because apparently of the voters during the anti-Ahok campaign, the biggest religiously driven mass mobilization in Indonesia, most of them are young people, most of them are higher educated, so they did receive education, they do have access to the labor market, but they perceive themselves to be hindered by people of a different race, which resonates with the fear against immigrants. That's why certain political campaigns in different parts of the world are resonating well with the anxieties that people feel. So this goes then back to the digital spaces in which people can express their anxieties and worsens the inequality into social inequality and political inequality. The question goes back to what Ravi is contributing and also what the chapter is contributing, that governance needs to be directed towards redistributing the information and cultural goods online in whatever means possible, and also the conditional cash transfer that is also applicable to infrastructure development in the outermost regions in Indonesia, so that more people can have access into the digital sphere. And lastly, it's about digital literacy that needs to go inside the curriculum and also go inside the digital sphere. So young people actually teaching each other how to be good citizens. And this, I think, is something, a skill, a future skill that perhaps my son would be better off than I am. He's 10 years old and he puts a vlog as his homework online and then shares it with his friends and they comment. So as a digital native, and of course this isn't in the national curriculum, so there's small pockets in the education system that allows these changes to occur, but there's also some outside of the system, such as community empowerment, community media that is also mentioned in the chapter, who are already offering alternative ways in using communication tools and redistributing information and knowledge in their own circles. So this is what Umum has mentioned as these have occurred or emerged sporadically, but governance has not linked this in a way that can make it more mainstream or more well known. And I would argue that communication, because digital products are almost without cost. I don't know how to finance this because I'm not an economist. Taxing Google seems like a good option. I don't know if that's feasible or not, but a footing that we have in that chapter is to vouch for more access, more quality, and more agency within the media community to have access to this sphere. So I'd like to look at that and
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed. It's been a long afternoon, and we're coming to the end of the 2 hours and so on. So let me just address at least some of the questions that were addressed to me, and then maybe we'll conclude. The event. Okay. So let me do it in reverse order. The questions from Smil. On the Piketty model, you know, I'm sure all of you are familiar with Thomas Piketty's book. It's quite an extraordinary book. You know, it's 800 pages with the charts and graphs and an equation or two. And it was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, knocking off a Disney thing for children's stories. So it's quite amazing, okay? And it shows you that the issue of inequality is so important in people's minds in general that this highly technical 800-page book with charts and graphs and tables was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. But and of course, the contribution of the book in terms of data, in terms of showing how the trends and so on, is just unsurpassed. And I think it's really wonderful. Where Piketty has been criticized, quite dramatically, is actually on that model, on the rate of return model and so on and so forth. Because in fact, it turns out it's not necessarily internally coherent or consistent. It will take us a technical discussion as to what it means in terms of elasticity of substitution, that both the share of capital has been rising and the rate of return to capital has been rising. Technically, what that implies is the elasticity of substitution is greater than 1, whereas all empirical findings are typically elasticity is less than 1. So just so in fact I wouldn't, the model, mathematical, is the one thing that is criticized by reviewers in the book, despite the fact that it really is a fantastic contribution. Why should we worry about inequality? As you say, of course, this is an old question. It's often put, well, equality is declining, why should we worry about inequality is another word that's put. And it's a good question to put, which is, if everybody is, if the tide is lifting all boats, so to speak, why should we worry that some boats are being lifted more than others? And so on? I would give several answers to that. I mean, one is a straightforward, practical answer that actually policymakers are worried about it. Okay? They are. I mean, Indonesian policymakers aren't sort of, policymakers aren't sort of saying, oh, well, everybody's being lifted, so there's no problem. Okay? The issue of inequality is indeed a political policy problem. We did a survey, we did a report, Asian Development Bank's Asian Development Outlook for 2012 was on inequality. And we surveyed 500 policymakers across Asia. And all of them invariably said rising inequality is a problem and something should be done about it. These are not NGOs, these are not the NGO types, okay? These are the Ministry of Finance people and so on and so on. So that's one response. The second response I would say is that from an ethical point of view, the variation, if you think about the social welfare function, then inequality would enter the social welfare function on standard philosophical terms. That would be another response. The third I would say is, even if you're interested in poverty, conditional on mean income, higher inequality means higher poverty. So that's another example. Another one, if you want to get even more technical, is that the growth elasticity of poverty reduction depends upon the level of inequality. So that's another argument. And then finally, the argument is that actually the level of inequality can also affect the level of growth in the future, and that's the work of the IMF and so on recently. Analyzing the data and arguing that actually there are strong empirical arguments for why the level of inequality will affect subsequent growth. So I think there's this whole series of reasons, ranging from this sort of philosophical, moral, to the very practical, that the policymakers are interested in it. So if you go to somebody and say, well, you should worry about inequality, because everybody, you say, don't get lost. I know that it's affecting me on the ballot box, and I want to do something about it. And there's everything in between. Coming to various questions that Mary raised. In terms of the UBI proposal, I think this raises a whole series of questions, okay? And there are also some technical questions that we can discuss about the fiscal cost of this versus not, and so on. And I and many other people have written about this. I think the question which we economists haven't really addressed, I don't believe, because it's not in our domain, so to speak, is the difference between somebody getting $1,000 as a check versus getting $1,000 having worked in some sense for it. Okay? It's that different, the dignity of work, the dignity of having earned this quote unquote, which is highly culture specific, which is highly context specific, and so on. That distinction we haven't quite right, because it's not economists' expertise, haven't really focused on this. So take an unemployed steel worker in Wisconsin who's lost $1,000. The economist answer to that is that the most efficient way of addressing that is you give the person $1,000. Any more indirect way of giving $1,000 will cost you more than $1,000. That's the basic economic intuition, economic analysis, and that's a good intuition to have. Okay? Well, of course, the steelworker would rather have $1,000 than not have $1,000, but is it a dignified form of receiving that transfer is the question. Okay? In South Africa, for example, there are these public employment schemes where people go and pick up rubbish on the highway. Maybe they have it on the highway, wearing orange jackets on the highway. They pick up the thing. Of course, the person would rather have the 100 rands that he's getting than not have the 100 rands. But qualitative work suggests they do not consider it to be a dignified form of earning income. And then when you say, what would you rather have? What is dignified? So, well, give me my car factory job back, or give me a government job. It's that intersection between economic efficiency of different methods of redistribution and the social acceptability of different methods of redistribution, which I think is the area for investigation in the next 15 to 20 years. And I've sort of written about that in different terms. So I think UBI, a lot of stuff. Again, very interesting about how does current technical change compare with the past structure? And I think a very interesting analytical question, And I've seen stuff going both ways. The usual anecdotal things. Well, when the motor car came in, obviously people who rode around in who built horse carriages were made unemployed, and so on and so forth. Okay. When the railways came in, the canal, and so on. There's all those. And eventually, over in the long run, everything was okay because. Well, first of all, we have to interrogate that empirically whether that's true or not. And actually, other people have also argued that the pace of change was also very fast in those days. But I think the question is, what comfort can we take from that? I don't think we can take any comfort from that at all. Okay? So the fact that in the Industrial Revolution, after a 40-year period, 50-year period of workers suffering, eventually it became okay. Of course, as a historical perspective, that's fine. As an analytical perspective, that's fine. And even if you believe that, which I think I do, is that if somehow we were magically to wake up 50 years from now with all these new technologies, new jobs will have been created and so on. But the people here will have died. So it won't be the same people. And the thing is, we have a real political economy on the ground here. We have Trump being voted in, let's say. So to tell the steel worker who's just been made unemployed because of technological change, technological shift, well, more jobs are going to be created by computer programmers and so on and so forth, and therefore you'll be okay, is not addressing the real issues, it seems to me, that we face, while accepting that from a medium-term point of view, the new technology will have its own implications in creating jobs and so on. That none of that is to be denied. So we don't want to be anti-technology, but on the other hand, we don't want to be say that everything will work out fine either. I'll leave the global institutions one to one side. Making projects more climate sensitive is really a very small thing. Okay, I mean, if you add up all the projects like the ADP and the World Bank and all these sorts of things together, it won't come to the investment of one county in China, for example. So I think, of course, it should be done, but to hold this up as the big sort of thing is quantitatively not as. Then coming back, and this links into the World Bank questions of Monica. Where would the grants come from? So that's exactly right. I mean, I think that's the practical question. If we were to be designing the new world order like Keynes and White, we would do this through grants. Okay, and then there would be a question where the governments would then be supplying those grants, not higher lending, etc. But I think that's a very important benchmark to have. Of course, I recognize we are where we are. Okay. And so then what do we have? We have, if I can use some technical inside World Bank terms, we have IDA reflows. We have countries that are repaying IDA, like Indonesia and so on. And the question is, how do we then deploy those? Do we re-lend those back, or do we use them as grant? What fraction of them do we use as grant? And of course, the moment you use it as a grant, you can't then get more income from it. And that's the usual argument that's put against not having grants. So, not denying any of these issues from a practical point of view. Let me conclude with knowledge products, since we're in a university and so on and so forth. Of course, every international institution eventually reverts to the thing. We're going to provide knowledge products. Not just the World Bank. You go to UNDP, they say that's what we're doing. We're providing knowledge products. You go to ADB, they say knowledge products is a big thing. Every institution is doing that. And that's fine, I suppose, because they think that this is the way, perhaps, for survival will be one way to do it. But if we were to design an institution, what would we require of a global institution that provides global knowledge as a global public good? You would need two things. Firstly, you would need competence, obviously, and secondly, you would need trust. Okay? need competence in terms of are these, and secondly, you need that in fact there isn't a second agenda in this institution that's providing this thing. And then you have to look to the governance of that institution to see whether the governance of that institution inspires trust or not. So it's actually a different level problem once one begins to think of it in those terms. So I've thought a lot about when I'm in the World Bank and outside about knowledge as the product of institutions like the World Bank. But I think it's deeply problematic in terms of whether an institution like the World Bank can be trusted enough to produce, whether those regressions that were run in the 1980s, which showed that trade liberalization was absolutely the right thing to do, which then were debunked later on. It's that baggage which I think the World Bank still has, although of course other things are, I'm a World Bank staff member, so other things are, all the things I do are very good. Anyway, let me stop there and
since I already opened it, now Mary has to close it.
Okay, yes, please.
Thank you. First of all, of course, thank you very much, Ravi, for, I think, a very stimulating dialogue. You can see from all the questions that you've hopefully woken a lot of us up to be more anxious, but more anxious in a good way, to find the answers, right? Because I think being anxious and then reacting in a very negative way, or looking for protection or policies that are going to not help us, is not the way we want to go. So actually, the objective of IBER is very much along those lines. How we can have research, provide evidence, so that we can answer the questions that we're anxious about. Like, I think, obviously, inequality, sources of inequality, and I think technological disruption is the big topic of the day. How that's going to impact Indonesia, and what does that mean in terms of education, in terms of many things, and policies, is actually probably the most topic that is causing a lot of anxiety everywhere. And rather than get the policies wrong, I think this is one of the pillars that actually we are proposing will be the research pillar for IBER. Just for your information, the other pillar is at the moment international economics, where we are looking at international trade, not liberalization, but trade and development, and financial safety nets and open macro, financial safety nets, resilience, and open macro issues. And we had a session in Bali, quite a successful session. So Khatib Basri is going to start that pillar and do more research on that. Given the turbulence in the world, I would say that's a very important pillar. So those are some of the updates for IBER. Just for your information, Pak Iwan mentioned that, Mas Iwan mentioned that Pak Budiono is the head, is the chair of the board. I'm a member of the board, and so is Mas Iwan. He didn't say he was a member of the board, so you can't run away. So our idea is to not just do research, but to do seminars like this. This is actually our first seminar. So, and oh yes, I was going to get to there, and I wanted to introduce that we actually have a little office opposite this building, right? Opposite MAKSI building. Yeah, that's right. We have a little office. And we have an executive director, Ibu Ari Damayanti. Can you please stand? So we're a startup, organization, but we have a secretary, we have an office, we have an executive director. I think that's a pretty good start. And hopefully, hopefully we can do more seminars. And I think Mas Iwan has promised to do a workshop on quantitative methods using your new book, right? So we hope to do that. Much like what we did in the past with PAU, we first to get a lot of the regional university professors to come and have a workshop on quantitative methods. So those are just some of our coming programs, and we are looking forward to all your continued support. And the fun thing I would say is that I'm glad that we're not all economists in this room. Unfortunately, Bu Meling is not here, right? She's always the one that reminds us think about the people, you know. Economists don't think about the people. So I'm very glad that we have non-economists, and because I do think this is a world where the research has to be multidisciplinary. So like what Ari said, that students have to work in teams. I would add to that, students have to work in a multidisciplinary way. So not just in the economics department, but there has to be multidisciplinary teams, because that's the only way we're going to be able to anticipate change. You know? So multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary. I think that should be one of the key ways forward. So thank you very much. Thank you to Professor Ravi again, and to all of you for your participation. And I think we have some awards to give you.